Hello, fourth grade, and welcome to Unit 6, Week 1. Let's start by going over our vocabulary. Your first word is the word intensity. Intensity is how strong or concentrated something is. So when you're staring at something with a lot of intensity, that means you're staring really hard at it. Or if you eat something that's really spicy, it has a really intense spicy flavor. Next, we have the word endurance. Endurance is the ability to deal with hardships or pain or stress, that you're able to work through those different struggles. Next, we have the word forfeit. When you forfeit something, you are giving up or you lose. So if you decide to forfeit a game, it's like saying, okay, I'm taking myself out of the game. I'm not playing anymore. So you forfeit. Our next word for this week is the word irritating. Irritating is a synonym for the word annoying. So something that's bothersome or annoying is irritating. Next, we have the word retreated. When something retreats, that means it's going back or it's withdrawing or pulling away. Now, think of when you see an animal. If you're going for a walk in the woods and you see a snake in the grass, you are going to retreat, right? You're going to step backwards and move away. You're going to withdraw or you turn back or go away from whatever it is because whatever it is may be dangerous. Next, we have the word despised. Despised is a synonym for hating something. When you hate something really intensely, or you think it's really bad or it's not good at all, you despise it. Our next word is the word ancestors. Ancestors are members of your family that lived a long time ago. So people that you are related to way, way back in your family tree are your ancestors. So some people have ancestors from different parts of Asia or different parts of Europe. Some people have ancestors that are Native American. So these are your relatives that go several generations back. And our last word is the word honor. To honor something is to show a lot of respect for that thing. So in a lot of cultures, you honor the elderly in your family, right? Because they're wiser and they're older. They know a lot about the world, a lot more than we know. Now, for our spelling words this week, we're going to focus on words that have the N sound in the end of it. And that N sound can be spelled either I-N, E-N, or O-N. And I highlighted them for you in your spelling words here so that you can see the differences. We have the words taken, sunken, 11, woven, widen, ridden, proven, often, robin, cousin, raisin, muffin, penguin, button, reason, cotton, wagon, dragon, common, skeleton, uncle, double, paddle, puffin, and vitamin. So you can see even with the different spellings, we're making that same N sound at the end. We're just spelling it in a variety of different ways. For our ELA and grammar notes for this week, we're going to revisit the ideas of connotation and denotation. So denotation is your dictionary definition. So they all start with the letter D. Denotation, dictionary definition. That means it's what the word means in the dictionary. It's the exact meaning of the word. Connotation is the feeling or the tone of the word. If the word is describing something in a more negative way or in a more positive way. So we can use the word aroma and the word stench. That's going to be my example. So aroma and stench both talk about the way something smells. When you look those up in a dictionary, aroma and stench are both referring to the way something smells. But when we're talking about something having, you smell the aroma of the baking bread, right? That has a positive connotation. It has positive feelings, right? Or a positive tone. Usually when we use the word aroma, we're referring to something in a positive or good way, something that smells good or delicious. The word stench, even though it has the same denotation, it's talking about the way something smells. When we use the word stench, we're talking about something in a negative way. So something can have a bad scent, like dirty laundry or a skunk. We're talking about the stench of something. We're talking about something that has a bad smell. Now, other words that we can use that have a similar meaning, similar denotation, but can be, depending on the word, we can use that meaning in a word that has a positive connotation or a negative denotation. I can use the words curious or nosy. Both of them mean someone who is inquisitive, someone who asks a lot of questions, but curious has a more positive tone or feeling to it. But when you're talking about someone who's nosy, we're talking about it in a negative way, right? We're talking about someone who's asking too many questions about things that are not their business. We can say slim and scrawny. Both of them mean something or someone that is very thin. Slim is said usually in a more positive way. Scrawny is in a more negative way. Someone who is confident versus someone who is arrogant. Both of those are people who have a lot of self-assurance. They know what they're doing. They know that they're good at something. But when we say someone is confident, we're talking about it in a positive way. When we're talking about someone who is arrogant, we're talking about it in a negative way. Usually when you're talking about someone who is arrogant, you're talking about someone who thinks they're better than other people or they're smarter than everyone else. So you can see how that has a negative feeling behind it. Same with the words selective and picky, right? Selective and picky both mean someone who is very careful in the way that they choose things. But selective, we think of it in a more positive way, that they're being careful. But picky means they just don't like anything, and they're really particular about everything that they want to do or choose. Same thing with the words thrifty and stingy, generous and lavish, or scarce and scant. So these are all words that that even though they have a similar denotation, depending on which word you use, it can either have a more positive connotation, a positive feeling, or a negative connotation, which is a negative feeling or tone. So for your assignment for this week, your assignment is specifically asking you to look up the denotation. Remember, that's the dictionary definition of the words that are being used and to write the connotation of that same word. So what it means, you're going to write what the word actually means, and you're also going to write the tone and the feeling of that word. Now make sure you're labeling both. So for example, I think I put one of the first ones in there. She could see her father's sleek canoe off in the distance. So the word that we're looking at is the word sleek. If you look up sleek in the dictionary, you're going to see something that is sleek is smooth and shiny, right? When we're reading the sentence and we're talking about this sleek canoe and you can see it off in the distance, you know that it's really well taken care of. You know, they polished it. That's how it got all nice and shiny. So you see how I labeled it, denotation, and I put the dictionary definition, connotation, and the feeling that the words are giving you. So when we're talking about a sleek canoe, we can picture in our head, or we can feel that it's something that's something that someone took really good care of, right? They're always cleaning it. They're making sure nothing is broken. They're polishing it all the time to make sure it looks beautiful. Now, next, we're going to talk about specifically number prefixes. So we've talked about prefixes a lot already, but number prefixes are prefixes that tell you how many. So uni or mono means one. So if you see that in the beginning of a word, we're talking about one of whatever it is. So a unicycle is something that you can ride that has just one wheel on it. A unit is one out of a group. If someone is speaking in a very monotone way, that means their voice is not going up and down while they're talking very flat like this, and it gets really, really, really boring. Or if we're talking about a picture that is monochrome, that means it's all kind of in one color, different shades of the same color. So it might be a picture that's, you know, just different shades of gray. Bi means two, like a bicycle has two wheels. Something that is biannual is something that happens 2 times in a year. Or if someone is bilingual, they speak 2 different languages. Next, we have the prefix tri, T-R-I. So tri means 3, like a tricycle has 3 wheels in it. A triathlon is a kind of race that has 3 different parts. A triangle is a shape that has 3 sides. The prefix deca means 10. Like a decade is 10 years, a decagon is a 10-sided shape. And then cent, which means 100. So a century is 100 years. If we're talking about cents, like in money, those are 1 out of 100 that make a dollar. Or a centimeter is 1/100th of a meter. The next thing we're going to cover are adverbs. So adverbs are words that tell us more about the verb, and it almost always answers these questions: how, when or how often, and where. So words like slowly, loudly, carefully, quickly, quietly, sadly, these are all adverbs. And usually, but not always, adverbs will end in ly, the ones that are telling you how something is done. So we can say they read their books quickly. That's how they read them. We walked quietly through the house. She was practicing her cursive writing carefully after school. So those are all telling you how. For when or how often, I can say we arrived late to class today. So late is when we arrived. Please remember to buy your zoo tickets early before they sell out. So early is telling us when, or before can actually be an adverb in this sentence as well. I'm getting ready for bed now. Now is telling you when. We always buy groceries from the farmer's market. Always tells us how often. I have a yearly membership at Disneyland. So how often do I renew my membership? Yearly, once a year. Or I never want to see a tarantula in real life. How often do I want to see one? Never, ever, ever. And then we have adverbs that tell where. So these can be directions that you're talking about. So the car turned right at the stop sign. So where did it turn? It turned right. I stepped forward to do my presentation. The bird flew away. We hiked up the mountain. Please put your backpack there on the rack. So these are all adverbs that refer to where something is or where something is going. And the last thing we're going to talk about is using the words good versus the word well. So how do you know which one you use? How do I know if I'm supposed to say you're doing very good or you're doing very well? How do I know which one is the correct one? There is a rule, and it's a simple rule for you to follow. So good is an adjective that describes or modifies a noun. Well is an adverb that describes or modifies a verb. So you use good when you're talking about a noun. You use well when you're talking about a verb. So well is for things that you do. Good is for nouns, persons, places, or things. Please use good handwriting. Handwriting is a noun, it's a thing. This pie is so good. The drawing is very good. So these are all talking about nouns. Now, I want to use well when I'm describing a verb, when I'm talking about how something is done. She built her sandcastle well. What did she do well? She built it well. So building is when you build something, that's a verb. It's a thing you do. Do you feel well? So feeling is a verb. It's a action word. He draws very well. So the draws is a verb. It's a thing that he does. How does he do it? He does it well. So remember, good is an adjective that's related to a noun. Well is an adverb that's related to a verb. So whenever you're not sure, look at what you're talking about. Are we talking about a person, place, or thing? Or are we talking about an action? And that will help you figure out which one you need to use. Now, for our story for this week, our literature anthology, we're going to be looking at a historical fiction story. Now, remember, historical fiction is a made-up story that could happen in real life, and it's based on an event that actually happened in history. So we're going to go ahead and read through this one.
Genre: Historical Fiction. The Game of Silence by Louise Erdrich. Illustrated by Joel Spector. In 1850, 9-year-old Omakayas, an Ojibwe girl, realizes her family's life near Lake Superior is about to change. After being forced off their land, her cousins, the raggedy ones, have arrived exhausted and starving. While the adults discuss serious matters in the lodge, Omakayas and the other children in her tribe must play a game of silence. Words, words, words. Pressing up from her stomach, trembling on her lips. Words buzzing in her throat like caught bees. Banging in her head. Harsh words. Angry words. Sounds boiling up in her like sap. Wild things she couldn't let out. Yow! A kick from her brother almost caused Omakayas to blurt an exclamation. Glossary of Ojibwe words. Ossinig. Aw, sin, ig. A pile of stones. Iya. E, ah. Yes. Gago. Gay, go. Stop that. Makakun. Ma, ka, kun. Containers made of birch bark. Makazinan. Ma, ka, zine, on. Footwear usually made of moose hide or deer skin, often trimmed with beads or fur. No. Omakaya sealed her lips together in a firm line and glared at her brother with all of the force pent up inside. If the fire from her eyes could scorch him, Pinch would be the first to yell out. Then he would lose the game of silence. But Pinch was used to receiving furious looks from his family. He knew just how to respond. First he looked innocently at Omakayas, as though he was ever innocent. He pretended he was unaware of the raging energy stuffed up inside his sister. Then, as Omakayas bored her eyes at him with increasing intensity, he lolled out his tongue and twisted his face into a deranged and awful mask. His features shifted into one ugly and absurd face after the next, until suddenly Omakayas just about, almost, laughed. Just in time, she clapped her hand to her mouth, closed her eyes, concentrated. Yes, Iya. She would be a stone. Ossinig, a pile of stones. Each one harder and quieter than the next. She would be silent and more silent yet. And in spite of her annoying brother, she would win. She kept her eyes closed, put her forehead on her knees. Thought stone, stone, stone. Ossen, ossen. Filled her mind with the sound of falling rain, which was easy. Outside, it was not just raining, but pouring down a drenching, cold, miserable, early summer shower. The rain had lasted for days, since the raggedy ones arrived. That was another thing. Besides Pinch, Omakayas couldn't stand rain anymore. The water made mush of tender new ground around her family's birch bark house. Droplets hissed through the roof vent into the fire, driving stinging smoke into her eyes. Everyone around her was affected. Nukomis's old bones ached, and she creaked like a tree every time she moved. The watery wind sent coughs racking through her mother's chest. It was too wet to play outside and cold when it should have been warm. Worst of all, Omakayas was stuck with Pinch. He nudged her. Omakayas almost slugged him in return, but controlled herself. She'd had enough of him to last her whole life. She opened her eyes a fraction, then her eyes went wide in shock. Somehow, Pinch had gotten hold of her beloved doll, and he was making it tedder on the cliff of his knees. Omakayas bit her lips so hard it hurt. Pinch walked her doll to the edge of his knees, then teasingly back. If only Mama was here. If only she would return. Nokomis concentrated on her work so hard, it was impossible to distract her. Stop and check. Reread. How does Omachia stop herself from laughing out loud during the game of silence? Reread to check your understanding. Omachia pretended to shut her eyes again, but cleverly watched until just the right moment to snatch back her doll. She sighed as though she was falling asleep, and then, with a flash, she grabbed. Taken by surprise, Pinch couldn't react quickly enough to hold on, and Omachia triumphantly clutched her doll. She stuck it down the neck of her dress. There, safe. Inside she laughed, but she didn't make a single sound. Not a chirp, not so much as a mouse's squeak. She was going to win the game of silence. She just knew it. Pinch was now poking little twigs into the fire in the center fire pit, watching them burn. Omachia tried not to notice him, but his head was so big and fuzzy. Pinch's hair sprang out with its own energy. Crafty eyes in his tough, round face calculated his sister's endurance. He was surely cooking up some mischief. Sure enough, Pinch drew the burning wand from the fire and laid it innocently next to her ankle, as though she didn't know that it would scorch her if she moved the slightest inch, and make her cry out first and instantly lose the game. She kicked it back at him. "Gago, Pinch," she nearly warned, but bit her lip. Yeah, he mouthed a taunt, making an impossibly irritating face that almost broke Omchia's discipline. Luckily, just at the second that Omchias decided to forfeit the game and to smash her little brother over the head with the big tin soup ladle, the visitors arrived. "They are here," said their grandmother. "You can quit the game until after we eat." "Ah!" Omachia exploded with such a wild sound of rage that Nokomis jumped. Pinch retreated, unnerved by how sorely he'd tested his sister. Omachia breathed out in relief. These visitors were her friends and cousins, Twilight, Little Bee, and Two-Strike Girl. They had brought the boy she called, in her mind, the Angry One. Her cousins were her favorite friends, the ones she counted on. Twilight was much like her name, quiet and thoughtful. Little Bee was funny and bold. Two-Strike was tough, and she could do anything a boy could do, usually better. Since her mother had died, she was wilder than ever. Even her father had not been able to handle Two-Strike, and had left her with Auntie Muskrat. But Auntie Muskrat had had no success in taming Two-Strike. Sometimes she was so fierce that she outdid everyone. It was a challenge to play with her. The girls had learned to sew and bead together, gathered berries, and helped their mothers clean fish. They also learned early on how to tan hides, a task that Omachia despised. And now, too, her sister, Angeline, was home. Omachia grinned with satisfaction. Pinch was delightfully outnumbered by girls and would pout, creeping to Mama's side when she arrived and turning into a baby, hoping to be pampered with tidbits of meat and maple sugar. Now everyone, the children and their parents, squeezed into the lodge. They had made the lodge extra big that summer, for visitors. For the first time, it was packed entirely full, but there was enough room for everyone. Even the Angry One found a space to sit. He glared from a little spot against the wall. Together, they ate rich venison soup from the shallow birch bark macacoon they'd brought along with them. 2 other men squeezed in, important men. Old Tallow entered, huge and rangy and smelling of wolf. She settled herself while outside her ferocious dog stood guard, unmoving and alert, even in the pelting rain. Each of Old Tallow's feet seemed to take up as much space as a small child, but Omachia didn't mind. Warily, but completely, she loved the fierce old woman. Each visitor brought a gift for the pile that the children who won the game of silence would choose from that night. For it was an important night. With the raggedy ones came serious doings, difficult questions, and impossible news. Great attention was needed. The grown-ups needed to counsel, think, absorb the facts without having to shush small children. The children could tell how important the meeting was from the degree to which their silence was required. The pile of treats was the best ever. There was a bag of marbles, some of actual glass, not just clay, a pair of narrow moccasinin that Omkayas thought just might fit her. One doll, elaborately dressed in a tiny set of breeches and a leather coat, a sharp knife, a deer knuckle game, 2 duck's bills of maple sugar tied together with split jack pine root, 6 red ribbons, a little roll of flowered cloth, 8 tiny bells, 1 small bow, and 6 arrows tipped with real brass points cut from a trade kettle. The arrows were fletched with the sharp black and yellow feathers of a bird that the island where they lived was named for, the golden-breasted woodpecker. Old Tallow must have brought them. What treasures! The children examined them breathlessly, each picking out one particular prize they meant to win. Little Bee, of course, wanted the doll. Two-Strike Girl, the bow and arrows. Pinch coveted the knife, but he was torn by greed for the maple sugar and the need for marbles to replace those he'd lost. The angry one did not deign to move from his spot or look at the gifts. No doubt he'd have no problem winning the game. As for Twilight, quiet and serene, she had no trouble playing the game, and she would be content with anything. Omkayas wanted the ribbons, the bell, and the marbles too, but she settled on the moccasinin because she had watched her grandmother make them so carefully. They were fancy, with velvet ankle cuffs, the tops beaded with flowers, and little white sparkling vines. Worth her silence. Stop and check. Reread. How do the children know that important matters need to be discussed? Reread to check your understanding. Now the grown-ups were ready to start talking. Nokomis sang the song of the game of silence 4 times, nearly catching Pinch at the end. Then she turned away from them too, absorbed in the talk. Omkayas looked longingly at Twilight, and her cousin made a sad and frustrated face. With her favorite cousin so close and her annoying brother so near, it was difficult to play. If only they could talk. At first, the girls communicated by mouthing words and moving their eyes, but the temptation to laugh was too great. They turned away from each other unwillingly. Omkayas listened to the rain, a solid drumming and hissing. Then she listened to the fire crackling and sighing. She watched the beautiful and changing glow of the coals. At some point, Omkayas couldn't tell exactly when, her attention was caught by something her father said. And then she noted that her cousin Twilight was also listening to the grown-ups' conversation. Soon, they all couldn't help but listen. They leaned forward, straining to hear every sound, almost forgetting to breathe. That night, for the first time, everybody got their prizes. Nobody lost the game of silence. For that night, they knew the threat of a much bigger loss. They would all fear to lose something huge, something so important that they never even knew that they had it in the first place. Who questions the earth, the ground beneath your feet? They had always accepted it, always here, always solid. That something was home. Genre: expository text. Compare texts. Read how Native Americans have fought to keep their traditions alive. Native Americans, yesterday and today. Native Americans of long ago. Long before you lived in your town, Native Americans hunted, fished, and farmed there. They lived off the land just as their ancestors had for centuries. Each tribe developed a way of life that depended on the area's climate and natural resources. Yet those ways of life changed once Europeans arrived. Scholars believe thousands, perhaps millions, of Native Americans died from diseases brought by white settlers in the 1700s. As the United States expanded, wars between the settlers and tribes erupted. Of the Native Americans who survived, many retreated from their lands. The rest were forced westward by white settlers and soldiers. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 relocated tribes west of the Mississippi River. This opened up 25 million acres to settlement. Native American groups in all regions had to cope with loss. While adapting to new environments, tribes struggled to maintain traditions. North, the Ojibwe. The lands of the Ojibwe, also called Chippewa, spread across what are now the states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and North Dakota. They built shelters called wigwams from bark. They used the bark from birch trees to make canoes. They hunted wildlife and raised corn and squash. One of the main foods of the Ojibwe was wild rice, a grain that grows on the lakes in northern regions. As settlers pushed into the northern United States, the Ojibwe were forced from their traditional lands onto small reservations in those 4 states. South, the Seminole. The Seminoles settled in what is now central Florida in the 1700s, on land controlled by Spain. They built cabins and wore clothes like those of the white settlers. Many raised horses and cattle. After the United States gained control of Florida in the 1830s, Seminoles were forced to relocate. Wars broke out between the Seminoles and the United States Army. Some Seminoles fled into the Everglades of Florida to resist relocation. There they hunted, trapped, fished, and traded in seclusion. Relocation of Native American tribes. Purple, Ojibwe. Brown, Seminole. Yellow, Cherokee. Blue, Hopi. The map above shows where the Ojibwe, Seminole, Cherokee, and Hopi tribes were relocated in the mid-1800s. East, the Cherokee. The Cherokee people lived on lands that are now the southeastern states from North Carolina to Georgia. They built shelters called ossi from wood, vines, and mud with roofs of grass or bark. They grew corn, squash, and beans. In the 1800s, one Cherokee leader, Sequoyah, invented a written alphabet for the Cherokee language. When gold was discovered on Cherokee lands, white settlers were eager to live there. This led to the forced removal of the Cherokee from their homeland by the United States government. More than 4,000 Cherokee died on the way to Oklahoma. This event is commonly known as the Trail of Tears. To the Cherokee, it is called the Trail Where They Cried. West, the Hopi. The Hopi settled in the high desert region of what is now Arizona and Colorado. In this area with little rain, they grew corn and other crops through a method called dry farming. Dry farming used tiny dams and canals to water the fields. The Hopi cultivated corn with long roots to reach water deep underground. They built shelters out of bricks made of mud and straw called adobe. An artist's depiction of the Trail of Tears illustrates the difficult journey made by the Cherokee. Native Americans today. These days, Native people lead different lives from their ancestors. Some groups living on reservations face poverty. Others have thrived economically. The wild rice that we buy today comes largely from the Ojibwe Reservation. Coal mining and tourism have supported the Hopi people. The Cherokee of Oklahoma have built hotels, hospitals, and entertainment centers. Tourism is an important source of income for the Seminole. Despite what they have endured, Native Americans today maintain ways to honor their culture and history. Dances and gatherings, called powwows, allow them to celebrate ancient traditions. Sharing stories with each new generation also helps to keep the Native American past alive in the present. Today, Native Americans work in all different professions. Modern Native American children participate in a powwow to honor their tribe's history.
Yeah, that takes us to the end of our literature anthology stories. Let's go ahead and hop into our reading and writing workshop. This is another historical fiction piece called A Surprise Reunion.
Genre: historical fiction. A surprise reunion. Chief Camawait looked with intensity across the Shoshone camp. The tribe prepared for the rabbit dance as warriors oiled their leather costumes. The dance was done to honor the rabbit as an important food source. The Shoshone had used traditions such as this dance since the beginning of time to mark special occasions and remember their ancestors. In the distance, laughing children were playing with a ball made from rawhide. They rolled the ball into a circle drawn in the dust. If the ball rolled outside the circle, the child must forfeit his or her turn. Camawait smiled as he remembered the games he had played as a child. But Camawait grimaced beneath his smile. He felt a dull pain in his stomach for his little sister. She had been snatched from the camp during a raid long ago. He despised those who had taken her. He closed his eyes and pictured the games they had played together. She had been scrawny and demanding and had an irritating habit of following him everywhere, he remembered. He missed her assertive manner and her constant questions. What had become of her? "It is time to ride," Hawk That Soars said, interrupting his thoughts. Camawait came back to reality, turned, and mounted his horse. A man named Captain Lewis had approached the Shoshone days before. Camawait knew that Lewis had come in peace, and so he welcomed him and his party. Lewis told the Shoshone his story. He explained that he was part of a company with a mission. He was to explore the land that stretched from the Missouri River to the Great Ocean. He then asked the chief for a favor. He explained that the rest of his party was waiting at the river with a supply boat. Lewis needed the strength and endurance of the Shoshone horses to help transport the supplies across the difficult land. In return, Lewis offered the Shoshone food and other goods. Camawait's party arrived at Lewis's camp. There he met Captain Clark. "Let's sit and discuss how we may help each other," said Clark. He led the men inside a large tent. Buffalo blankets were spread all around. As they settled inside, Lewis addressed the chief. "We travel with a woman who knows your language." A slender woman with long dark braids entered the tent. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtered through the thick cloth. She nodded to the chief. I am Sacagawea, she said. Kamewait could not believe his eyes. He examined the features of her face. He watched as her expression slowly changed. He immediately knew this was the same sweet face of his lost sister. Sacagawea quickly ran to him. Tears filled her dark eyes. The pain and sadness that Kamewait had carried over the years retreated to a forgotten place. "My brother," she cried, "is it really you? How long has it been?" Lewis and Clark were happy to have been unwitting partners in this reunion. Chief Kamewait promised them he would provide whatever help and resources they needed. "You have given me a great gift," Kamewait told them. "You have reunited me with my beloved sister. Our people will sing and tell stories so that all may remember and honor this day for generations to come."
All right, that takes us to the end of our stories for this week. For our comprehension strategy and skill, we're going to work on rereading, which is basically a strategy that we use when we come across information that either has a lot of facts in it, so we have to go back and reread to make sure we understood everything, or it has maybe some words or phrases that we don't understand fully. So we go back and we reread, we use our context clues to help us understand the message that the author is trying to send. Now, the theme is exactly that. It's the overall message that the author wants to communicate to the readers. So to figure out the author's theme in the story or in a passage, take a look at the characters and what they're doing and how they're behaving, the things that they're saying, any kind of changes they make throughout the story, and that'll give you an idea of the author's theme.
Reread. When you read historical fiction, you may come across new information or unfamiliar ideas. As you read A Surprise Reunion, stop and reread any difficult sections of the text to make sure you understand them and remember key details. Find text evidence. You may not be sure what a rabbit dance is and why it is part of the Shoshone culture. Reread the first paragraph of A Surprise Reunion on page 383. Chief Kamewait looked with intensity across the Shoshone camp. The tribe prepared for the rabbit dance as warriors oiled their leather costumes. The dance was done to honor the rabbit as an important food source. The Shoshone had used traditions such as this dance since the beginning of time to mark special occasions and to remember their ancestors. I read that the rabbit dance is a Shoshone tradition that honors the rabbit as an important food source. I can infer from this that the Shoshone have a close connection to nature. Theme. The theme of a story is the overall message or lesson that an author wants to communicate. To identify the theme, think about what the characters do and say and how they change. Find text evidence. When I read page 383, I learn that Chief Kamewait is thinking about his younger sister who was snatched in a raid. He misses her. I think these details are clues to the story's theme. Graphic organizer. Detail. Watching the children playing reminds Chief Kamewait of his sister. Detail. Chief Kamewait feels pain at the loss of his sister. Caption. Pay attention to the character's thoughts and feelings. Historical fiction. This selection, A Surprise Reunion, is historical fiction. Historical fiction takes place in the past, includes realistic characters, events, and settings, may include real people and actual events, includes dialogue. Find text evidence. A Surprise Reunion is historical fiction. I know that Chief Kamewait and Sacagawea are real people. The dialogue is fictional since the author could not know what was said during the meeting between Chief Kamewait and Sacagawea. Dialogue. Dialogue is the words that characters speak in the story. Dialogue helps you understand what the characters are thinking and feeling. Connotation and denotation. Connotation is an idea, meaning, or feeling associated with a word. Denotation is the literal dictionary definition of a word. Find text evidence. When I read the word scrawny on page 383 in a surprise reunion, I know its connotation differs from its denotation. The denotation is very thin. The connotation is weak and vulnerable. She had been scrawny and demanding and had an irritating habit of following him everywhere, he remembered.
All right, that takes us to the end of our notes for this week. If you guys have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I hope you have an amazing day. Take care.